Riverman William Hill looks over his rubber barrel made of 14 tubes bound with fishnet, which he believes will take him safely over Niagara Falls.
Some people chase glory, others chase, well, stupidity. From a lawyer who turned his office window into a personal exit, to a daredevil who thought a wooden barrel could outsmart Niagara Falls, and even a preacher who believed lions could read the Bible, these are the ultimate champions of the Darwin Awards.
Authorities say the 26-year-old was killed, possibly by bow and arrow, on what police described as a misplaced adventure in a highly restricted area.
Join us on this thrilling episode as we dive into the most ridiculous ways people remove themselves from the gene pool. The Lion Whisperer. The University of Ibadan Zoological Garden is a great place for families to enjoy nature and see animals they have only watched on TV. But in 1999, visitors got a show they never expected, a live demonstration of why faith alone is not a survival strategy. At the center of the drama that unfolded that day was Prophet Daniel Abadurin, a man with more conviction than common sense. Inspired by the biblical Daniel, who supposedly spent a cozy night in a lion's den, Abadurin believed he could pull off the same miracle. Armed with nothing but a big Bible and unshakable confidence, he approached the zoo staff and made a request that left them in stitches. He wanted to enter the lion's cage. At first, they thought he was joking. He wasn't. Maybe he begged. Perhaps he found a way to sneak in. Witness accounts vary. But what's certain is that soon enough, there he was, standing inside the enclosure, staring at the king of the jungle like he had divine plot armor. Dressed in a flowing red robe, he held up his Bible like a medieval knight raising a shield. He began chanting, summoning divine protection. The lions, perhaps confused by this unexpected buffet delivery, hesitated. Encouraged by their momentary pause, Abadurin probably thought, "Yep, it's working. It's just that nothing was working." Nature does not read the Bible. Once the lions realized dinner had walked in voluntarily, they did what lions do best. In an instant, they pounced. Abadurin tried to fight, but, well, let's just say faith isn't a substitute for fangs and claws. Within moments, it was all over. His robe was in shreds, his Bible was then just part of the scenery, and his grand miracle was canceled. Outside the cage, chaos erupted. Families screamed. Parents covered their children's eyes. The zoo staff probably had the worst day of their careers. What started as an attempt to prove divine intervention ended with a tragic and slightly Darwinian lesson. Faith is powerful, but it's not lion-proof. Spreading the gospel.
The island was off limits to protect outsiders and the tribe, which has no immunity to modern diseases. This morning, investigators are trying to figure out who else might have been involved in that fatal mission.
John Allen Chow had a dream to walk onto a remote island filled with people who had never seen a missionary before and introduce them to Jesus. What could possibly go wrong? To prepare for this, he attended a missionary boot camp where they trained him using a pretend native village and fake spears because nothing gets you ready for a dangerous, uncontacted tribe quite like a live-action role-play session. By 2018, Chow was ready. He landed in Port Blair, Andaman Islands, and stocked up on gifts, medical supplies, and picture cards, because obviously, showing some doodles was the perfect plan for breaking a language barrier spanning thousands of years. He also paid 2 fishermen about $380 to illegally sneak him near North Sentinel Island, where the locals had made it abundantly clear for centuries that they preferred 0 visitors. Chow, however, was undeterred. In his diary, he wrote that he believed this was Satan's last stronghold on Earth. He even told his family not to be mad at God or the islanders if they sealed his fate for him, which, in hindsight, was some solid foreshadowing. His first approach was in a canoe, armed with a waterproof Bible. When the islanders reacted with confusion, laughter, and hostility, he tried singing worship songs at them and speaking in Xhosa, a language they definitely didn't understand. Eventually, he decided to back off when they started shooting arrows at him. On his next attempt, he got a little closer and was met with a young Sentinelese boy who promptly shot an arrow straight into his Bible. Again, a clear message. Still, Chow wasn't giving up. On November 17th, he told the fishermen to leave him behind so he could fully commit to his mission. The next day, those same fishermen saw the islanders dragging his body along the shore and later burying him in the sand. The Indian government briefly considered retrieving his body, but after weighing the risks, they ultimately decided, yeah, no, not worth it. The islanders were left alone, as they had always wanted. Meanwhile, Chow's death sparked debate worldwide. Some saw him as a martyr, others as an entitled trespasser who ignored history, science, and multiple very clear warnings. Survival International slammed him for risking the health of the tribe by exposing them to potential new diseases. Even his own father blamed the missionary community for filling his son's head with extreme ideas. As a final honor, Chow was posthumously awarded the 2018 Darwin Award, and 5 years later, the National Geographic made a documentary about him called The Mission. But somehow, it seems like the Sentinelese already knew the ending. Conquering the Niagara Falls. In the history of questionable decisions, few can compete with Charles Stevens, a Bristol barber who decided that giving haircuts wasn't thrilling enough. Instead, he set his sights on something much more exciting, plunging over Niagara Falls in a wooden barrel. Now, Charles wasn't just any daredevil. He was a father of 11, which might explain his desperate need for some peace. Maybe he figured a trip down the falls would be the most relaxing part of his day. Either way, he confidently declared that this was a cool commercial proposition. What he really meant was that he was about to make some serious cash. For his grand stunt, he chose an oak barrel. Not the best choice, but hey, he was the expert. To keep himself steady, he also brought along an anvil. Yes, an anvil. The same thing cartoon characters use to crush each other. Fellow daredevils Bobby Leach and William Redhill Sr. begged him to test the setup first, but Charles, brimming with confidence and possibly lacking some survival instincts, waved them off. Strapped inside the barrel, with his feet literally tied to the anvil, Charles went over the Horseshoe Falls. The result? Instant regret. The anvil, proving once again that gravity is undefeated, punched through the barrel and dragged Charles to a watery fate. When rescuers searched for him, all they found was his right arm, the only part of him that got a proper burial. So, if you ever visit Drummond Hill Cemetery in Niagara Falls, Ontario, know that the most adventurous barber's lone limb is somewhere under the grass. In 1994, Charles received a posthumous Darwin Award, 74 years after his glorious exit. The ultimate window test. Back in 1993, Gary Hoy was a strong and healthy hotshot lawyer, but on July 9th of that year, he decided to show off his engineering knowledge in front of a group of law students. His brilliant idea? Proving that the windows in his Toronto office were unbreakable, by full-on body slamming into one. On his first attempt, Gary ran and threw himself at the window. Just as he predicted, it held. Feeling like the smartest guy in the room, he decided to go for a second round. And that's when tragedy struck. As he lunged at the glass again, the window didn't break, but the frame gave up on life, and Gary and the entire pane flew 24 stories down. Yeah, the glass stayed intact. The frame? Not so much. It was game over for Gary. This tragic yet completely avoidable stunt sent shockwaves through the legal world. His law firm, Holden Day Wilson, never recovered. Morale collapsed, employees left, and just 3 years later, the entire firm shut down in what became the biggest law firm closure in Canadian history. And because the internet never forgets, Gary's name lives on as a legend. His story has been covered by Mythbusters and 1000 Ways to Die, and he even won a Darwin Award. Because let's be real, this was natural selection at its finest. Lesson of the day? If you want to prove something is unbreakable, maybe just tap it instead of tackling it. The Fallen Hero. Petty Officer Brandon Dilbert, a U.S. Navy crewman, went out doing what some might call the ultimate daredevil stunt, Supermaning, not in a cape, not in a comic book, but out the back of a moving MH-53 helicopter over the Persian Gulf. And it ended about as well as anyone would expect when mixing military hardware with mid-air tomfoolery. Supermanning, for those who do not know, is when someone straps themselves to a safety belt, leans out of an aircraft, and strikes that classic Superman pose. Arms stretched forward, legs straight, wind blasting their face like they're in an extreme skydiving commercial. It was the kind of stunt that made troops laugh, earned bragging rights, and occasionally got some legendary in-flight photos. But it also came with the obvious risk like what happened next. In full Supermanning mode, Brandon was strapped in and soaring until his grip slipped. And in an instant, he was gone. No epic battle, no last stand against overwhelming odds. Just a miscalculated stunt, a loose harness, and a 125-foot drop into the Persian Gulf. His body was recovered 4 hours later, and the Navy wasted no time launching an investigation. Turns out, this wasn't some isolated incident. Supermanning had been a long-running, unofficial tradition among some crew members, because of course it was. Rear Admiral Denby H. Starling II found that this had been happening for over a decade. 4 other crew members fessed up to their airborne antics, and let's just say, the Navy wasn't amused. Aircrew designations were stripped, heads metaphorically rolled, and Supermanning was officially grounded forever. But here's the thing, Brandon's passing was still ruled as in the line of duty, which means, despite the absurdity of it all, he's officially recognized alongside heroes who made the ultimate sacrifice. So, while his story might sound like something from a military blooper reel, it's now a part of history. And somewhere out there, you know there's still an old Navy vet shaking his head, chuckling and saying, "Man, we really did some dumb stuff back in the day." The peak of streaming. The late streamer Tetsu wanted to give his viewers an unforgettable live stream. He definitely delivered. But not in the way he intended. Mount Fuji is no joke. It's Japan's tallest peak, a sacred mountain, and a brutal challenge even in summer. In the off-season, it's an icy, unforgiving nightmare. That's where Tetsu decided to go for a fun little hike. Dressed like he was headed to a Tokyo cafe, armed with only climbing poles and a smartphone, he named his stream, "Let's Go to Snowy Mountain Fuji." Like he was visiting a winter wonderland, not a deadly mountain. At first, things seemed fine. He laughed, chatted, and climbed. But then the snow got deeper, the wind got colder, and the complaints started rolling in. His hands began to numb, and he had no heat packs. His viewers might have started feeling bad for him, until he made it clear he was more worried about keeping the livestream going than keeping himself alive. This was the moment to turn back. A sane person would have. Tetsu? He powered forward. With frozen hands juggling his poles and phone, he reached a point where the safety fence just ended. The trail was now steep, narrow, and treacherous. He noticed but continued, and his viewers were left helplessly watching as he edged closer to disaster. The slope was 30 degrees, pure ice, and his sneakers had about as much grip as butter on a frying pan. Then came the dreadful call for help. Anyone who has experienced mountaineering knows you get one chance to stop a fall. Drop the phone, dig the poles in, and save yourself. But no, Tetsu's hands clung to his phone, and gravity did the rest. The stream kept rolling as he tumbled, feet flailing, poles flying, camera shaking, until, finally, silence. The last image was a climbing pole, frozen mid-air. His viewers did the right thing and called for help, but by then, it was too late. They found Tetsu's body 1,000 meters from where he fell, at an altitude of 9,800 feet. He didn't need much to survive. Gloves, crampons, and an ounce of common sense. He could have had a fantastic video and another 47 years to enjoy it. But in the end, it wasn't the cold that took his life. Standing on business. At midnight, Inspector Campbell Hill's phone rang. Someone had fallen into the cave garden sinkhole. Not exactly the kind of wake-up call anyone wants. He barely had time to curse before calling the fire department. This was going to be a long night. Cave Garden Sinkhole is a breathtaking spot in Mount Gambier, South Australia. It's got lush green vines, roses, and even a waterfall. A safety fence surrounds the whole thing, and a viewing platform with a wrought iron railing gives visitors a thrilling but safe view of the 100-foot drop. Well, safe for those who followed the sightseeing rules from that type of height. Bradley Streeter, a 20-year-old who loves adventure and cars, did not. At midnight, he decided that standing on the platform wasn't enough. No, he had to do a handstand. On the railing, above a 100-foot drop, because why not? Unfortunately, physics had other plans. 1 second, he was upside down, showing off for his friends. The next, he was plummeting into the darkness. By the time first responders arrived, there was no miracle rescue. Bradley passed away instantly. Foul play was ruled out, but what was the cause of the accident? Inspector Hill had to hear it twice before it really sank in. A handstand on a railing over a sinkhole. Handstands are fun, on solid ground. Worst case, you land on your butt. However, doing it 100 feet in the air is challenging the laws of physics to a duel. Bradley was young, talented, and had his whole life ahead of him. But in one reckless moment, he went from daring to doomed. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't foul play. Just a simple, preventable mistake. In the end, gravity was not the culprit. The Gold Quest. Michael Sexton had one thing on his mind: treasure. Not just any treasure. $2 million worth of gold, supposedly buried somewhere in the Rocky Mountains by an eccentric art dealer named Forrest Fenn. The clues were hidden in a book, and Michael was convinced he had cracked the code. The only problem was that about 350,000 other people had also tried and failed. Worse, 4 of them had lost their lives, but in Michael's case, he knew where it was, meaning that they were all foolish and he was not. So, he roped in a 65-year-old buddy, packed light, and set off for Dinosaur National Monument in February 2020, expecting to be rich by sunset, but then reality did hit hard. He was also foolish, just as he had labeled those before him. Michael and his friend found no treasure, lost their way, and nearly froze. Luckily, rescuers found them just in time. It was a close call, and one would argue that Michael learned his lesson. But nope, he had gotten used to proving everyone wrong, literally. 1 month later, he was back at it. He had recovered, regrouped, and convinced the same unlucky buddy to give it another shot. This time, they had to find it. COVID-19 was just starting to shut things down, and authorities warned hikers to avoid dangerous terrain. However, mere warnings were not going to stop Michael. He packed 2 bottles of water, a few candy bars, and Fenn's book. That was it. They rented snowmobiles, loaded them, and drove off into the mountains. Watching them leave, the rental agent probably took one look and thought, yeah, these guys aren't coming back. And he was right. After nightfall, when they failed to return, the agent called authorities. Search began. By Friday morning, they found the truck. By Saturday morning, the abandoned snowmobiles. And by Saturday afternoon, they found the 2 men, just a mile from where Michael had been rescued for the first time. But this time, there was no second chance. Michael didn't make it. His friend barely survived and refuses to talk about it to this day. As for the treasure, in June 2020, Forrest Fenn himself claimed it had finally been found. But he provided no proof. The FBI started asking questions, and lawsuits began piling up. Some say the treasure never existed. Some say it was full of illegally obtained artifacts. Either way, Michael bet his life on it, and lost. What is the moral of the story? Pack more than a couple of candy bars if you go treasure hunting. Or better yet, maybe just don't. How not to weld. Meet Howard Miller, a professional welder from New Zealand who took DIY a little too far. The guy was handy with metal, always ready to help out. But on September 3rd, 2018, his helpfulness turned into a real-life fireworks show, one that earned him a Darwin Award. So, what happened? Miller was helping a friend weld an exhaust pipe onto a classic Holden Kingswood sedan. But instead of using proper welding gear, he rolled up with an experimental setup, an LPG bottle packed with acetylene and oxygen. Now, for anyone who snoozed through chemistry class, that's bad. Like, really bad. There's a reason professional welders keep those gases in separate tanks. When mixed, they burn hot enough to cut metal. And if they don't have a proper flow regulator, there is absolutely nothing stopping them from going boom. Miller's friend took one look at this death trap and left. But Miller? Nah, he was confident. He attached a torch head straight onto the bottle, lit the welding tip, and, well, you can guess what happened next. The flame crept back into the bottle. The bottle exploded. Stocked with 20 liters of paint thinner and gasoline, the shed disintegrated. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows in nearby houses. The car was gone, the shed was also gone, and the friend was probably looking for a new welder. Miller, by all accounts, was a kind and generous guy. But if there's one thing he left behind, it's a hard lesson. Welding and chemistry don't mix, unless you want to make the evening news. The Door of Terror. Born around 864, Louis III became co-ruler of West Francia alongside his younger brother, Carloman II, after the death of their father, Louis II, popularly Louis the Stammerer. West Francia wasn't exactly all of France as we know it today. It covered a good chunk of what's now northern and western France, including Paris, Normandy, and Brittany. It was a big deal. Despite his young age, Louis III proved himself a capable military leader. His most significant moment of glory came in 881 at the Battle of Saucourt-en-Vimeu, where he and Carloman II led the Frankish forces against the Vikings, like the real-deal, longboat-sailing, axe-wielding Norsemen who were raiding Europe like it was a hobby. Surprisingly, the young king crushed them in battle, securing a massive legendary victory that was even recorded in an epic poem called the Ludwigslied. But just as he started making a name for himself, fate, or more accurately, a door, had other plans. In 882, at 18, Louis saw a young woman in the streets of Saint-Denis and decided to pursue her. Whether this was innocent courtship or a medieval case of "I'm the king, let me woo you" is up for debate. Either way, the woman wasn't interested and ran into her father's house for safety. Louis, a determined young man, chased her on horseback, but here's where things go sideways. Literally. As he rode full speed toward the house, he didn't see a low-hanging lintel, basically the top part of the doorway. He smashed straight into it, hitting his head so hard that he fell off his horse. 2 days later, he passed away from the injury. Just like that, the promising young king, the Viking Slayer, was taken out by lousy architecture. Some historians argue that he may have passed away from an illness, but the KO'd by door version is just too ridiculous to ignore. His younger brother, Carloman II, was left to rule alone, but he didn't last much longer either, passing away in a hunting accident just a few years later. The royals left a message for us. Always look where you're going, and don't chase people or animals who don't want to be chased. The welder who discovered artillery. In 2017, a Russian welder, Vargas, was working on highway repairs when he suddenly had a genius idea. And by genius, I mean the kind of idea that ends up in a cautionary tale. Vargas noticed that a fire extinguisher fit perfectly inside a decommissioned artillery cannon. Most people would have marveled and then moved on with their day, but not Vargas. He was about to take welding to the next level: ballistics. He stuffed the fire extinguisher down the barrel but wasn't done yet. He decided to supercharge this experiment with a chemical reaction using calcium carbide and water.
Calcium carbide and water. Oh shit.
If you're unfamiliar with it, this combo created acetylene gas used in welding torches, which is very explosive. Vargas did his magic, and then the moment of truth arrived. The cannon fired, but the fire extinguisher went flying. What exactly was the problem? Well, the cannon fired quite all right, but so did shrapnel and metal fragments that went straight into Vargas's head. Turns out that when shrapnel and an empty skull collide, the shrapnel will always win. And that, my friends, was how one man accidentally turned himself into a battlefield casualty in peacetime. Just because something fits into a cannon doesn't mean you should fire it. Becoming a showman after retirement. Roy Halladay was a legend on the baseball field, but the sky is a different game entirely. On November 17, 2017, he took his brand new Icon 5 for a joyride over the Gulf of Mexico. He had tweeted about how flying it felt like piloting a fighter jet. One concerned fan replied that he should be careful. Unfortunately, those words of advice were ignored, and a few weeks later, he was gone. Talking about Roy's ecstatic feeling, the Icon 5 is far from being a fighter jet. It looks sleek on the outside, but under the hood, it's more like a 1912 biplane with fancy packaging. It's a light sport aircraft, designed for casual flying, not high-speed aerobatics. And while it's small and powerful, that doesn't mean you can go full Maverick and pull Top Gun stunts. Even the lead engineer and director of engineering for the plane learned this the hard way. Both lost their lives in a canyon-crashing disaster earlier that year. But Roy? He was feeling bold that morning. He got up, towed his plane to the beach, and went through his pre-flight checklist. The wings were properly attached. He took some drugs, washed them down with alcohol, and then he was ready. What followed was a cocktail of bad decisions: morphine, amphetamines, sleeping pills, and booze. One would think that after a career of home runs, he'd know that this was a lineup destined to strike out. Once in the air, Roy wasn't just flying, he was showing off. Steep climbs, sudden dives, skimming the water at crazy low altitudes. Boaters and fishermen watched in horror, some even recording as they feared the worst. And then, the worst happened. He pulled into a steep climb, his speed dropped, and the plane stalled. In an instant, he spun out of control, flipped upside down, and slammed into the water. The impact didn't end his life. What did was him drowning.
Major League Baseball great and Bay Area resident Roy Halladay killed in a plane crash today. The aircraft found upside down in the Gulf of Mexico, not far from the coast of Pasco County.
And just like that, a sports legend was gone. The new high. Back in 1988, doctors were warning against a dangerous and downright insane new way people were abusing cocaine, injecting it directly into their urinary tract. Yeah, you heard that right. Some people skip the usual methods and go straight for the worst possible idea. Take this one guy, for example, a 34-year-old man who decided to pump cocaine into his urethra, that's the pee hole, for those who didn't pay attention in biology. His goal was to boost his performance in bed. Instead, he ended up with a 3-day-long erection, excruciating pain, and a trip to the hospital. Now, having an erection for 3 days might sound like something out of a book filled with false information, but in reality, it's a medical emergency called priapism. Things only got worse for the man. After days of struggling to pee and dealing with severe pain, his erection suddenly disappeared. But then, blood started leaking into his hands, feet, chest, and, yes, his already doomed genitals. Doctors rushed to save him, but the damage was too severe. His blood wasn't flowing correctly, causing tissue to die all over his body. In a desperate attempt to stop the spread of gangrene, doctors had to amputate both his legs above the knee and all but one of his fingers. As for his penis, it just fell off, on its own, like a tragic drug-fueled magic trick. Now, believe it or not, this isn't the first time people have tried using cocaine as a sexual enhancer. Some rub it on their genitals to delay climax or boost sensations, but injecting it is a whole new level of self-destruction. For those thinking of injecting drugs into their private parts, the only thing you'll be stimulating is a fast-track ticket to the hospital, if you're lucky. The ultimate faith test gone wrong. A holy man in Pakistan decided he was ready to take his miracle game to the next level by pulling off a full-blown resurrection. The only problem was that he had never actually done it before. But why let a little thing like zero experience get in the way of a divine experiment? For 5 years, this Sufi had been impressing the villagers of Mubarakabad with his so-called miracles, and now it was time for him to perform the ultimate miracle, to prove he could bring someone back from the dead. But not just anyone. He specifically wanted a married man with kids. You know, someone who had every reason to want to return from the afterlife. Solid logic. Muhammad Niaz, a 40-year-old man, heard the call and thought to give that a shot, so he volunteered. The plan was simple. Send him to the afterlife on one day, resurrect him the next. No big deal. On a fateful Tuesday, the Sufi announced the grand experiment. On Wednesday, Muhammad was sacrificed, and by Thursday, the Sufi was in jail for taking someone's life. It turns out that resurrection is a lot harder than it looks. Now, usually, a Darwin Award isn't given for crime, but in this case, Muhammad literally signed up for it. He believed in Sufi to the end, but unfortunately for him, the only thing that came back to life was common sense. Just a little too late. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.